Hello all, welcome to the Solocast of Firecode Tech. In these episodes, it's just going to be me, your host, Gus Gagliardi. There's going to be a range of topics, but I'm going to talk about specific technologies, installation standards, codes and how they work, as well as some other interesting topics that don't neatly fit inside of the context of a normal interview. Hello all. Welcome to episode 12 of Firecode Tech, the Solocast. On this episode, we're talking about fire barriers, fire partitions, and firewalls. I want to take a moment and thank our sponsors for this episode, Wachter, but we will be giving more information about Wachter and the opportunities associated later on in this episode. Yes, I wanted to talk about fire and smoke dampers, but I realized that you can't very well talk about fire and smoke dampers if you haven't laid the groundwork for what the different types of rated separations are in construction. So on today's episode, we're going to talk about what are firewalls, barriers, and partitions, how are they rated, what are the codes and standards surrounding firewalls, barriers, and partitions, and answer the question, what is a firestop? Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode and follow us on social media. Oh, and if you could give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, it would be a big help to the show. Let's get into the show. So I want to start with what are firewalls, barriers, and partitions. And so I'm going to go through these in order of most complexity to least complexity. So we're going to start out with firewalls. Another reason why I thought it was important to go over this subject is people frequently exchange the terms firewalls, barriers, and partitions synonymously, and they are anything but synonymous in the building code or the standards which address these rated separations. So as always, we're going to, start with the basis of our discussion in, the codes and standards surrounding the subject. And as always, we're going to discuss it through the lens of the United States codes and standards, even though the approach may be similar despite your geographic location. To understand these terms, they are likely going to be very similar, but always remember to base your interpretation of the subject in the codes and standards that apply to your jurisdiction, and then to seek in those codes and standards the definitions and criteria as they are defined in the document that is adopted by law. So for the purposes of our discussion today, I've pulled some definitions out of the 2015 International Building Code, which is what Oklahoma as a state adopts and what Oklahoma City adopts, but they'll be very similar in other versions of the International Building Code or the IBC and other versions of different guiding fire and life safety documents. So let's start with firewall. Firewall is defined in Chapter 2 of the International Building Code as a fire resistance rated wall having protected openings which restricts the spread of fire and extends continuously from the foundation to or through the roof without either collapse of the wall, with sufficient structural stability under fire conditions to allow the collapse of construction on either side without collapse of the wall. So this is the most important part of firewall, and why my ears always perk up when people toss this term around just kind of nonchalant or casually. A firewall means this rated separation is structurally independent from the rest of the building. So that means through the slab, and then also penetrating, extending through the roof. And so this is a considerable construction and considerable cost. So anytime I hear people say firewall, my ears perk up, and I ask, do you really mean firewall? Oftentimes they don't, but I think it's very important. Firewall is the most, I don't know if intense is the right word, but it's the most expensive, It is the most challenging to design around, and so it's a good one to start with because it is probably the most difficult one to accommodate. In the building code, there are only a couple ways in which you can define a building, like two separate buildings within one larger building. Or, the question is commonly asked to me, how do we determine if these two structures are the same? So in the eyes of the fire and life safety tabulations of the building. And so there are two common ways for you to determine if these buildings are sufficiently separated. One of them is if you have a firewall between the two buildings, then this is a way in the eyes of the building code to separate these. So if you have building A separated by a firewall from building B, these are two separate buildings and two separate fire and life safety calculations in regards to the building code. This is an important distinction because neither a fire barrier nor a fire partition have this effect. So the definition we just read was in Chapter 2, Section 202 in Definitions of the International Building Code, but more specific requirements for firewalls can be found in Chapter 7, Fire and Smoke Protection Features, and more specifically, Section 706 for firewalls. So now that we've touched on a firewall, let's talk a little bit about how these firewalls, barriers, and partitions are rated before we move on to barriers and partitions. And there's a lot more to cover on firewalls, but we'll see how this episode goes, and there could be a situation in which I dedicate an entire episode to firewalls. They're so challenging and important to the building code and the way that we construct buildings. The fire protection rating is defined as the period of time that an opening protective it will maintain the ability to confine a fire as determined by the test specified in section 715. Furthermore, it states ratings are stated in hours or minutes. So further on our discussion of this fire protection rating, let's talk about NFPA 221, which is a very important document when talking about firewalls, fire barriers, and fire partitions. NFPA 221 is the standard for high challenge firewalls, and fire barrier walls. So NFPA 221 is a great document if you are confused about firewalls, fire barriers, and fire partitions. It goes in depth more into this subject than the building code does. The building code will tell you when you need these, how to construct them, and some of those requirements. But I feel like if you are just diving into this subject and having a little bit of difficulty understanding the differences between the three, NFPA 221 is great for providing a little bit more information on the subject. I want to take a moment to talk about our sponsor today, Walkter. Walkter is a family-owned business that provides services in many commercial and industrial market sectors, including electrical and fire alarm systems, the Internet of Things, digital transformation, and much, much more. Walkter is headquartered out of Lenexa, Kansas, but is decentralized in that they have technicians across the nation. They are looking for good candidates for fire alarm technicians in a variety of locations across the U.S. You can find out the details of these jobs and much more about Walkter on walkter.com/careers. That's WACHTER.com/careers. Let's get back to the show. Another great note about NFPA 221 is it is a reference standard in the building code. So depending on what version of the building code is adopted, you can go take a look and see what version of NFPA 221 is adopted. So this standard does have the effect of law, depending on what portions are adopted in your applicable building code. So I bring up NFPA 221 because I wanted to talk about the standards which describe the fire protection rating. So what standard do you have to test your listed assembly or structure to get it rated at a certain hour rating or minute rating? So you can find these standards, these listing standards, in both NFPA 221 as well as the International Building Code. So the first one is ANSI/UL 263, which is the standard for safety of fire tests of building construction materials. And the second one is ASTM E119, standard test methods for fire tests of building construction materials. And then if you look in NFPA 221, it also says any other approved test methods in regards to section 4.3.2. 4.3.2 describes the analytical methods which are acceptable in order to evaluate a rated separation. Just a bit of example information, or I guess exposition on the subject. Firewalls and fire barriers are generally in ratings of 1 to 4, so that's hours. So generally, most of what you will see is probably in the 1 to 2, and sometimes you will get in the extreme scenario in which you see a 3 or 4 hour firewall. And so yeah, these start to get very expensive. Firewalls are very difficult for structural engineers to design, and it presents a lot of difficult design and construction dilemmas. So these are really things that, unless they are extremely necessary, are to be avoided. Let's move on to fire barrier. A fire barrier is described as a fire resistance rated wall assembly of materials designed to restrict the spread of fire in which continuity is maintained. Fire barriers is addressed in Section 707 in the International Building Code. I want to talk about this topic of continuity. It's mentioned in the definition of fire barrier and fire partition. So these firewalls, barriers, and partitions are listed and rated assemblies. So we want to keep the integrity of these listed and rated assemblies. So when we penetrate these assemblies, or when we have an opening in these assemblies, we need to protect these openings/penetrations. Say you have a piece of ductwork going through a rated assembly, or a piece of pipe that is going through a rated assembly. You need to provide a listed firestop product in order to retain the continuity of this listed assembly. All of the different rated separations we've talked about today are a component of passive fire protection. Fire barriers are much more common than firewalls, as most facilities or buildings are not large enough or of significant of enough fire and life safety challenge to need the use of a firewall. There's a list at the beginning of 707 that describes some common places where you might find fire barriers. I'll just list a couple. Shaft enclosures, interior exit stairways and ramp construction, exit passageways, horizontal exits, atriums, incidental uses, control areas. All these are examples of places which have fire barrier requirements, and so all these things are a lot more common than needing to provide a totally separate building. At least, I guess I should say these are more common in the occupancies and the types of buildings that I'm used to dealing with. Maybe in large cities or in exceedingly high hazard. If you did business in a lot of just extremely hazardous locations, then you would be more have more frequent use of firewalls. But they're expensive, so owners typically don't want them. So there's mixed use not separated, which I was speaking with the fire marshal just this last week. He's saying that 95 plus percentage of all the buildings that he deals with are mixed use not separated. But if you did have a mixed use separated occupancy, then fire barrier would be the way that you split up your building in order to give yourself a larger building allowance. We could do a whole episode, and probably will do one over occupancy and use. It's a very deep topic, but I thought I'd offer that up for another area in which these listed separations are common. The last one on the list is fire partitions. Fire partitions is described in the building code as a vertical assembly of materials designed to restrict the spread of fire in which openings are protected. So here's the big misconception point here is the difference between fire barriers and fire partitions. Here's a good excerpt out of the 2021 edition of NFPA 221. Says, fire barrier walls shall be continuous from one of the following or a combination thereof. An exterior wall to an exterior wall, a floor below to a floor or roof above, one fire barrier wall to another fire barrier wall, firewall or high challenge firewall having a fire resistance rating of not less than that required for the fire barrier wall. So these are a list of ways in which you have to have continuity for fire barrier walls. Fire partitions are a little bit less restrictive as far as where they can terminate. Fire partitions are listed in Chapter 7, Chapter 7, Section 708 in the International Building Code. Here are a list of a couple different areas in which you can find the requirements for fire partitions. Separation in walls as required by 420.2 for groups I1, R1, R2, and R3. Walls separating tenant spaces in covered and open mall buildings as required by 402.4.2.1. Corridor walls as required by 1020.1. Elevator lobby separation as required by section 3006.2. Egress balconies as required by 1019.2. So as you can see that these are not as common of types of partition, so specific occupancy. So they have a list of institutional and residential occupancies where you would have these separations around different spaces within the buildings. And then, so this is an illustration of where you would find these partitions. And for me, the location in which these separations are used is the most telling part of how they differ between each other, and also the continuity where these listed separations start and stop are also a huge way to determine how to describe and differentiate between these two. Just a recap here at the end of this episode, we discussed what are firewalls, barriers, and partitions. What are the codes and standards surrounding firewalls, barriers, and partitions? What is firestop? And also we spoke about how these systems are rated and listed. That's it for this episode. Don't forget, if you are liking this content and you want to hear more Solocast episodes, you can go check out patreon.com/firecodetech. That's patreon.com/firecodetech for 2 more of these episodes a month for the price of a cup of coffee. We'll see you next time on Firecode Tech. Thanks for listening, everybody. Be sure to share the episode with a friend if you enjoyed it. Don't forget that fire protection and life safety is serious business. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are by no means a professional consultation or a codes and standards interpretation. Be sure to contact a licensed professional if you are getting involved with fire protection and or life safety. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.